Welcome to the Nestle Nutrition Institute Education Series. This program is one of many developed to bring contemporary nutrition topics to healthcare professionals. Financial support for this presentation was provided by Nestle Health Science. The views expressed herein are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent Nestle's views. The material herein is accurate as of the date it was presented and is for educational purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.
These are great young nutritionists, and I think you're going to get a kick out of their personalities and the quality of their talks. So the first one we'll start with is Sarah Bonus. She is an assistant professor of medicine and internal medicine at the Mayo Clinic. She's on the faculty there with Ryan Hurt and Manpreet Mundy, and she's going to talk about this exciting area of emulsifiers.
So as Dr. Martindale and Dr. McClave alluded to, we're going to be talking about emulsifiers this morning. And just to describe the influence of food emulsifiers on gut health, food shows up in the headlines on a somewhat regular basis, whether it's the romaine and the E. coli or other things. But a couple of years ago, this came out with study links common food additives to Crohn's and colitis. And then we have a picture of ice cream implicating it potentially in inflammatory disease. And if you read through the articles, what they were actually talking about was the emulsifiers in these food products and their potential impact on the gut. So if we take a walk down memory lane back to our high school and college chemistry classes, what is an emulsifier? We're trying to mix two things that don't usually mix, oil and water, Bob and Steve, those sorts of things. And you put enough force behind it, homogenize it, and you try to get them to stay in solution together. So there's a variety of ways that we can do that: surfactants, biopolymers, texture modifiers, or weighing agents to help keep these things in solution. Across the world, they're used in a lot of our food products, but they're regulated somewhat differently throughout the world. In the Europe, UK, and New Zealand, there's an international numbering system, so they may not actually show up on the food label, but it may be listed as a number. And there's a joint Federation of Agriculture organization through the UN, as well as World Health Organization committee that works together on this. In the US, we have the Food and Drug Administration. They have to have pre-market approval, but the caveat for a lot of them is that they're under the GRAS status, or generally recognized as safe. So we haven't had the thorough evaluation and testing that we've had for many of our other products. A couple of common ones that we see that are found in this category are the carboxymethylcellulose and lecithin. Another challenge with these is even if you read the food label, if it's a component of the food product or diluted down to a significant amount, it may not actually be listed on that label there because of the very small quantity that's present in food. And because many of them are in GRAS status, we don't have defined levels of toxicity. These aren't normally consumed in the diet kind of prior to modification. And so we don't know how much is too much or what some of the more significant impacts could be. If we look at the different types of emulsifiers, we have the surfactants, and this is going to be using our ionic components to help mix those two hydrophilic, hydrophobic sorts of things. Common examples: mono and diglycerides, polysorbates. The vast majority of these are going to undergo standard fat digestion, and you look at heavy whipping cream, even that is going to have an emulsifier in it. We have our amphiphilic biopolymers, these to increase viscosity. Many of our proteins, some polysaccharides. The proteins are going to be digestible, the polysaccharides frequently not so much. So your almond cheese, think you're getting it healthy, and we've got some casein in it to help make that product what it is. Texture modifiers will increase viscosity. These are our modified celluloses, pectins, carrageenan, and most are indigestible, but some are able to undergo fermentation by gut bacteria. So going back to our ice cream, there's our cellulose gum and gel. And this is a standard food label from one of the nutritional supplements that I recommend to many of our patients. Again, an emulsifier to keep that stable there. Weighing agents are frequently used in beverage products. So our lemonade has our sucrose acetate isobutyrate. And why is the food industry using them so much? Well, look at these two bowls of mayonnaise. Which one would you rather eat? The one on the left or the one on the right? They used for appearance to avoid that separation. Your mayonnaise is going to have your oil and your water, and you need an emulsifier to hold it together. It also enhances taste, flavor, texture, color, and makes food more visually appealing. The aroma of food, that can be impacted by some of these products as well to encapsulate that pleasant aroma. And to compensate for recipe adjustments. Frequently, we're looking for the low-fat version or the low-sugar version, but fat, sugar, all of these things have properties in food chemistry, and that's why they're used to make things taste the way they do. So when we modify those recipes, we need to figure out ways to make those products still have that similar taste, feel, and texture. So looking at the gut and the impact there, we'll kind of take a walk through the different layers. We'll start in the intestinal lumen. The CMC here is carboxymethylcellulose, one of the common emulsifiers used, and it has a variety of impacts. It can cause bacterial growth. It can actually increase bioactive flagella, and so make these bacteria a little bit more pathogenic. But not all emulsifiers are going to have these impacts. If we compare carboxymethylcellulose and polysorbate versus egg yolk phosphatin actually increases macrophage phagocytosis, so may be helpful to our gut, whereas others could be harmful. Under the intestinal lumen, we have the mucus layer, another barrier between what's outside and getting in. And there's a variety of ways they impact that too. Mucus production can be increased by some of the emulsifiers, but they don't all have the same impact. And there's also alterations in gut flora. Some enzyme or some bacteria, such as ruminococcus, can be mucolytic, and the growth of these bacteria tend to be promoted by some of these emulsifiers. However, they may be beneficial. There's a lot of research going on with curcumin right now, and if you mix curcumin with some of these emulsifiers, we're actually able to absorb it a bit better, such as furosemide as well. So other things that we may want to improve absorption, some of these emulsifiers may be helpful, but they have an impact in a variety of ways. Under our mucus layer, we have our intestinal epithelium, and these can increase that permeability and loosen some of those tight junctions so that we can have bacteria translocate across this layer and get into our bodies. So we kind of walked through the different layers here, from the lumen to the mucus layer to the epithelium. They can have a variety of impacts there. Even past that, though, the metabolism of some of these products, such as lecithin, can lead to production of trimethylamine, which has been implicated to be atherogenic, thrombotic, and otherwise pro-inflammatory. So we walked through those layers, and in conclusion, emulsifiers are distributed very broadly in our food and nutrition supplements. This was the pathophysiology of how it could work, and my colleague Dr. Laster is going to go a little bit more into the data of what have they been implicated with as far as in the gut. There are many different types of emulsifiers, and they can impact the gut differently. Some may be good, some may be bad, but being aware of that will be important as we proceed. And looking at the different mechanisms to see, are there things that we can take from these products that may actually enhance products that we want versus cause potential harm. I think for next steps, as far as looking at the role of emulsifiers in overall health, not just our gut, but understanding the prevalence in the food products. If you look at food labels, they really are everywhere, but it can be difficult to ascertain how much is actually in the product that you're looking at. I think another challenge is we are aware of food deserts and places that it is difficult to get high quality food. So understanding some of the socioeconomic differences in our food consumption patterns, as well as further evaluation on the impact in humans. A lot of these studies are done in vitro or in animal studies, and so we may not know exactly how they can impact our bodies. These are a few of the references. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was very good. So the next person today is Janice Laster. She's in private practice in Georgetown or in Washington D.C. right now. She graduated in gastroenterology last year, and she's going to give us a continuation of that story. Come on up, and we'll get this going here.
So I'm going to have a continuation from Dr. Bonus's talk and more about emulsifiers, more than you ever wanted. So today we'll talk a little bit about the summary of emulsifiers from Dr. Bonus's talk, the approval, kind of the safety controversy, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about animal studies in emulsifiers and obesity. So from Dr. Bonus's talk, we learned that CMC and polysorbate 80 can change the actual microbiota composition itself, decrease that mucus layer that's there for protection, increases that tight junction permeability, thereby allowing bacteria to break through that epithelial layer, and also this causes a cascade of inflammation that can stimulate metabolic syndrome. So how did we used to eat? This was we initially started as kind of hunters and gatherers, getting enough food for what we needed so we can sit at the table with our families. And now we've gotten a little bit beyond that, right? So we do more than just getting what we need. We're on the go. We're more civilized. We have foods that come from vending machines, and we go through a lot of more drive-throughs now. So we look at a multiple hit hypothesis as we come from being hunters and gatherers to being more civilized and having processed foods. And during this, you can also see that we have changes in diet, sanitation, increased antibiotic use, C-sections, and formula. And this leads us having changes in our microbiota diversity. And one of the things that interests me and some of the researchers were, what are some other contributors to this obesity epidemic? And one of those other contributors may be the pervasive use of emulsifiers in our food and the processed food. Now, I was excited to find during my research, because Steve and Bob love to have a dogfight, if they've probably said over the years to you guys here. So I was excited to find that initially in the 1960s, when Congress tasked FDA to make sure these additives were safe, there were about 800 additives, and now it's grown to over 9,000. And during that time, there was a long process in which these things were approved. However, in '97, the industry says, guys, it's taking too long. We need these things to go to market much quicker. And there was a shortage in FDA staff members at that time, so it took much longer. So they said, okay, fine, we'll change these things to being labeled as GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And we won't take so long. We'll get you from years down to months. In 2014, there came about many lawsuits, and the FDA came under extreme scrutiny. In this Washington Post article, there was a quote by one of their the FDA commissioners that said, we don't actually have enough people to say these things are actually safe. So my question was, when is the GRAS not just okay to throw in our foods? And so these two brilliant scientists from Georgia State University, Dr. Chassing and Gerwins, decided they would look more into this and did a landmark study on dietary emulsifiers in the mouse microbiota to find an actual model and to understand this better. So their study design included administering carboxymethylcellulose and polysorbate 80 in mice and in water and in chow in different levels. Looked at the changes in the proximity of the bacteria in the epithelium, which correlates to that mucus layer we've been talking about. They looked at the changes in the microbiota, pro-inflammatory gene expression, which we know leads to colitis that we see as gastroenterologists grossly, and they looked at this histologically, and looked at measured fat mass and adiposity, looking at hyperphagia, glucose dysregulation, and bile acids as well. And what you can see here is a representation of water in blue, CMC in orange, and the P80 in purple here. And this was seen in all of the different strains of mice that they studied, which were 3. And as you can see, there's a statistical difference from going from left to right here. You see an increase in body weight. In B, you see an increase in fat mass. In C, you can see that there is an increase in hyperphagia in the mice that were treated with emulsifiers. And in D, you see that there's an increase in their blood glucose levels as well. So across the board in each strain with these emulsifiers, you saw these changes. So those were their conclusions, that CMC and P80 indeed did induce inflammation, which was the hypothesis. Showed this decrease in mucus layer, which decreases our protective component, increases in adiposity, fat mass, and alternations in this microbiota composition as well. Another study, they said, well, how does this translate to humans? So they collaborated with Van de Waal, who had a human model that as an ecosystem, and they did the same thing. He used the P80 and the CMC on the single human microbiota to alter composition, gene expression, and increase pro-inflammatory potential. Again, the same thing was recreated. Interestingly here, finding that subtle differences were that CMC induced changes more rapidly. Within 1 day of consuming CMC, you saw changes. And with P80, it took a little bit more time. So what did this all mean kind of on a larger level? Colitis is something that I can see on an endoscopy when I'm doing colonoscopies, but here they were able to show histologically this breakdown in the lumen and this mucus layer was able to see breaks in the epithelium, knowing that that would lead to inflammation and inflammatory cells, leading to a cascade of more inflammation, decreased insulin sensitivity, which leads to metabolic syndrome and activating these already metabolically active fat cells, which for the research is proving to be indicated and shown in obesity. So there's many studies that are occurring now to look at these tight junction permeability in the industrialized food, stemming from data that we know from different studies in Europe versus Africa, and looking at these children that have had markedly different diets and showing their changes in obesity rates and their microbiota, showing the impacts of even these food additives on the gut-brain axis and anxiety levels. Also, the influences with dietary components and microbiota. So a lot of things that are underway here and us trying to foraging forward to figure out what's going on. So in conclusion, the prevalence of obesity continues to rise in our country, along with the use of emulsifiers and processed foods. So, in these mice models and the in vitro human models have shown that emulsifiers causes these changes in gut microbiota, inflammation, and changes in increased fat mass. So to echo Dr. Bonas, some of the future research should be in looking at human toxicity, giving our increased quantity, which is well beyond what was initially approved in the 1950s and 60s. Looking at the effects on the microbiota in humans and trying to do prospective studies to look at and using artificial intelligence to look longitudinally at the food that we intake and how this factors into other changes in the microbiome as well. And the bottom line, and how I get this back to my patients at the bedside and when they're coming to clinic, is getting back to real food and trying to do that a little bit more and cooking a little bit more as well. Thank you guys for your time.
Our next speaker is Dr. Carrie Austin. She's an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin. She's going to talk on the topic of the superiority of Wisconsin cheese. No, she's not. She's going to talk about
that sounds more interesting.
She's going to talk about the nutritional recommendations on short gut syndrome.
Okay, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be talking about cheese, but if I had known I could have, I definitely would have. Today, I'm going to be talking about nutrition considerations for short gut syndrome. And my objective today is, based on the literature and current data, for you all to be able to identify the appropriate nutrition recommendations for a patient with short bowel syndrome, given their individual anatomy. So I'm going to start with a case, and our case is a 70-year-old man with short bowel syndrome from mesenteric ischemia over 10 years ago. He's admitted to the general surgery service with a short bowel obstruction thought to be secondary to adhesions. And as he progresses and improves throughout his stay, the GI service is consulted for high ostomy output. So a really common patient, his normal output is usually around 1 liter a day, and in the hospital he's up to 4 liters a day. They're just not able to send him home. So our resident goes to see him and focuses on the things I tell her to before she goes, specifically looking at the anatomy. So when dealing with any short gut patient, the first thing you need to know is what you're dealing with, what's left and what's missing. Also, how long has this been going on? He's been very stable. No changes in his medications for the past 12 months. He's been on his home doses of PPI, loperamide, octreotide for well over a year. So what's different? What's different about his stay in the hospital than when he goes home? Specifically looking at his diet, which is what I'm going to focus on today. Like I mentioned before, knowing the anatomy of these patients is important. Specifically regarding short bowel syndrome in nutrition, the key is going to be whether or not they have a presence of a colon in continuity. Generally, there are lots of different ways to classify short bowel syndrome, acute or chronic, and then secondly, based on anatomy, do they not have a colon as in type 1 with an NJ genostomy, or is there a colon in continuity as in types 2 and 3? Secondly, why does location matter? Well, the absorption of most of our nutrients occurs within the first 150 centimeters of the small bowel. There are certain things that are known to be preferentially absorbed in certain areas, But luckily with short bowel syndrome, a lot of times patients have adaptation, and the gut is really able to compensate for a lot of these missing of these locations. What about the colon? Why does the colon matter in these patients? About 25, 35 years ago, or way back, a long time ago, we used to think that the colon was just there to absorb water. But now we know better. The colon does have additional absorptive capacity in these patients and can really help maintain them off of TPN, which is our goal oftentimes. So getting back to what are the current recommendations? Well, in our type 1 patients, or those without a colon, our macronutrient recommendations are as follows. So 40% carbohydrates, 40% fat, and 20% protein. Where do these numbers come from? Well, a couple of studies back in the 80s and 90s really looked at these patients' absorptive capacity of both fats and carbohydrates. And you can see on the left here, on the y-axis, this is looking at patients without a colon. On the bottom, you have the dietary fat, and that's pushed up over in these patients along the x-axis. On the y-axis is the absorptive capacity. So as those patients increase the amount of fat in their diet, their absorption of the fat also increases. What about type 2? Or types if they have a colon in continuity? In these patients, we want to push up the complex carbohydrates. And coming from the same 1994 study, you can see that on the left, their absorptive capacity of fat reaches a peak and then actually decreases. So by pushing up fat in these patients, they found that it actually interferes with the absorption of other macronutrients, including protein and carbohydrates. So you can actually be doing a disservice to these patients by increasing the fat in their diet. So if you don't remember anything else from this talk, which you probably won't, just remember this slide. So in patients who have no colon, think about trying to increase the fat in their diet. This is going to reach a point at which you're going to overload them based on palatability. There's only so much fat you can eat. Although I live in Wisconsin, so maybe that's debatable. But there's only so much fat you can eat before they're going to get steatorrhea, and they're just not going to be able to tolerate an extremely high-fat diet. Whereas in your patients who have their colon in continuity, these are the patients that you want to be pushing the complex carbohydrates. Now, where does this data come from? I have to admit this data is not necessarily our best work. They're old studies. You can see here from 1983 to 1998. That's about the last study that really looked at dietary recommendations for short gut syndrome. The number of patients is quite low. So we're making these broad spectrum recommendations on a study of 5 patients. And if you look at the amount of small bowel left, these are vastly different patients. A patient with 30 centimeters of small bowel is completely different from someone who has much more than that. So they have different nutritionary recommendations and guidelines, and we just don't have the data to support that. So what carbohydrates should we be in general? So that was based on the individual anatomy. Now I want to step back and say, in general, you have a patient in front of you with short bowel syndrome. What recommendations can you give them? Well, for everyone, simple sugars are going to be bad in general. They're going to have a high osmotic load, pulling fluid into the gut lumen and worsening their output. Complex carbohydrates are where we want to focus in these patients for a couple of different reasons. One, in those with a colon in continuity, these carbs have added benefit of the unabsorbable carbohydrates by fermentation of colonic flora into short-chain fatty acids. So they can actually increase the caloric intake that they're able to absorb. What about fiber? Well, in patients with a colon, they've shown that soluble fiber is beneficial. Things such as oatmeal can help thicken their output and increase the calories absorbed. Now that comes with a caveat. Some patients don't tolerate pushing up fiber. They can actually worsen the diarrhea and worsen gas and bloating. So you have to individualize it and see how that patient does. What about fats? Well, we want high quality sources, so rather than our picture on the left, which looks phenomenal, really encouraging patients to eat more things that are on the right side of the field. And then getting the essential fatty acids, making sure those are part of their dietary intake. Protein, there's been a lot of studies in protein in other aspects of nutrition, but a kind of a paucity of data in this subject in short bowel. We do recommend high quality sources throughout the day with each meal. There were some studies back in the 90s looking at glutamine and growth hormone, but that's really fallen out of favor as there wasn't a lot of benefit found. So getting back to our case, so as a 70-year-old man with short bowel syndrome admitted with a small bowel obstruction who was having problems with ostomy output. When we talked further with him about his diet in the hospital was mostly popsicles, Jell-O, and nutritional supplements, high osmotic foods or drinks. He met with a dietitian and was educated on what to eat based on his anatomy. And simply based on changing his diet, we changed to no medications. He was able to go from 4 liters of output down to his baseline of around 1 and able to discharge home. So just to summarize what sort of recommendations you can make broadly for these patients when they see you in clinic, we do want to individualize our data, our recommendations based on the patient's individual anatomy. Also want to encourage whole intact foods, chewing foods well and eating multiple small meals throughout the day to help increase the amount of time that those nutrients are in contact with the absorptive surface of the lumen. And then food journals can be really helpful for these patients, especially early on, trying to identify foods that are worsen their output versus improve it. What don't we want to do? We want to tell them to avoid hyperosmolar foods and drinks. So pretty much everything this man was drinking in the hospital was directly worsening his output. In general, these patients should stay away from the raw vegetables, fresh fruits, insoluble fiber. And then be careful with liquid diets in these patients. Oftentimes they're highly osmolar, so that can be difficult.
So our next talk is going to be Dr. Matt Casper. Dr. Casper has been a resident or fellow for the last 37 years. He started in surgery and then switched to gastroenterology, so please don't let that suspect decision impact your ability to judge this presentation on the ketogenic diet and athletic performance.
As we said, my topic is ketogenic diet and athletic performance, lose weight, make gains. It is kind of a lighthearted title, but I think it's an interesting subject. We spend a lot of our time talking about nutrition as a way to either treat or prevent disease, and I think that sometimes we forget that as people who focus on nutrition, there's also a lot of opportunity to take people who are very well functioning and help them function even better. The objectives for today's talk is to review the scientific literature regarding low carbohydrate ketogenic diets in athletes, understand the basic physiology of energy storage and utilization in exercise, think about ways that this physiology may limit an athlete's ability to perform, understand the rationale for the dietary intervention that we're going to discuss, which is the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, and then to evaluate and summarize the available evidence for this diet's efficacy in real-world settings. So starting off and realizing that the topic of athletic performance is really a very broad one. We have a very heterogeneous group of athletes in terms of intensity and in duration of exercise. A powerlifting athlete may exercise with 100% intensity for less than a second. A elite marathoner will run at sort of a more moderate level of intensity for somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours. Cyclists, people in events like the Tour de France may be going for more about a day at a time. And then you have sports more like field sports where the intensity of exercise is highly variable over the course of the event. You may have periods of very intense activity that are interspersed with periods of either lower intensity or almost complete rest. And then finally, there's a group of athletes who really don't care too much about how the muscle functions and are just primarily interested in how it looks. I think we also have to think about the idea that across even a single sport, there's a huge spectrum in terms of the athletes that participate in it, and that we may not all have the opportunity to work with an elite athlete, and that many of our patients are going to be functioning more on the amateur end of the athletic spectrum. Yeah. So I wanted to include pictures of all of the faculty, but there are actually no documented instances of any of the other faculty participating in any sort of athletic activity. So, sorry, Steve. So energy utilization and exercise. ATP is the fundamental form of usable energy for our cells. A single muscle cell may contain up to 1 billion molecules of ATP, and that muscle cell can go through those billion molecules of ATP in just 1 to 2 minutes of activity. When that ATP is gone, it has to be replaced, typically via aerobic pathways, oxidization of substrates in mitochondria. Often it's going to be glucose or fatty acids. And glucose is actually a little more efficient as a substrate in terms of the amount of oxygen that's required to get calories. You get about 3% more energy per liter of oxygen consumed. So glucose is a better substrate, but your muscles will try to avoid using it if they can. Muscles will preferentially use fatty acids until the intensity of exercise reaches somewhere in the 65 to 75% VO2 max range. And that's depicted in this picture here. On the x-axis is sort of aerobic power or intensity of exercise going from left to right. And then you see that there's a point at which the fat substrate kind of decreases and the carbohydrate utilization ramps up. So if glucose is so great, why don't we use it all the time? And the answer is that effectively it's a storage problem. It's inefficient to store energy as millions and millions of single glucose molecules. We compensate by storing glycogen. Glycogen being a large molecule that's long chains of glucose linked together in these sort of branching patterns. And a gram of glycogen can contain up to 50,000 glucose molecules. Glycogen storage in the body, we store about 500 grams in our muscles, we store about 80 grams in our liver, and if you were to oxidize all of that completely, you'd get about 3,000 kilocalories of energy. It sounds like a lot, but when you look at the energy utilization of an elite level athlete in an Ironman triathlon, they go through about 9,000 calories over the course of a day. Contrast that with lipid storage in the body, where a 70-kilo athlete who's relatively lean at 10% body fat will have 7,000 grams of adipose tissue, or theoretically up to 63,000 calories of energy that are available. The question then becomes, is this a target for intervention? Can we enhance an athlete's ability or propensity to oxidize fatty acids? And this is where we have the ketogenic diet. The idea being that an athlete adapted to a ketogenic diet may uprate their machinery of lipolysis and fatty acid oxidation, as well as ketone body synthesis, and in doing so decrease that athlete's reliance on glucose and glycogen. So now looking at the studies, there is a lot of heterogeneity between trials. Typical macronutrient balance for what they declared to be a ketogenic diet would be less than 50 grams of carbohydrate a day, or less than 10% of the total daily calories as carbohydrate, typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% is fat and the rest is protein. Studies had variable run-in and adaptation periods, anywhere from 7 days to up to 6 months before they would retest the athletes. Not all the studies tried to quantify or confirm ketosis with beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, and not all the studies measured body composition. Most of the studies focused on sports that had objective and not judged outcomes. They looked at race walkers, ultramarathon athletes, cyclists, Olympic weightlifters, CrossFit athletes, resistance-trained novice men and obese women, and then novice male runners. Steve, you weren't studied, sorry. So now the results. So for the race walkers, no significant difference in performance in times in 10 and 20 kilometer walks. The ketogenic diet group actually had performance losses during the first 3 weeks as they adapted to the diet. The ultramarathoners, they showed increased rates of fatty acid oxidation, actually pretty marked, and no real significant difference in pre and post muscle glycogen stores. The cyclists who cycled 100 kilometers with a sprint period at the end had no difference in their time trial or sprint times, but the authors did note that there was improvement in power that was reported as watts per kilo of athlete body weight in the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet group. As far as Olympic weightlifters, no significant difference in performance. The same thing was seen with the CrossFit athletes, the resistance-trained novice males and obese women, and with the amateur runners, it didn't seem to make a difference. So the question then becomes, is this sort of a lost cause and can we give it up? And I think the answer generally is no, because one consistent effect of this diet, despite no change in performance, up or down, was the fact that these ketogenic diet athletes all, with the exception of the race walkers, had significant weight loss. And in the studies that measured body composition, it tended to be more adipose tissue than lean body mass. I think the race walkers' failure to lose weight may be partially explained by the fact that they were a very lean group to begin with. The average body mass of these athletes was 62 kilos, so they were pretty light and may not have had a lot of weight to lose. And the effect was pretty marked in the CrossFit athletes. They were losing up to 12% of their body weight over the course of this intervention. So for conclusions, I think that there's a biochemical and physiologic argument that increasing an athlete's ability to oxidize fatty acids may improve performance in endurance and prolonged activity sort of events. I think, unfortunately, there's no clear evidence that supports that this diet provides any real-world performance benefit or necessarily a harm. I think that some of the studies have shown that adaptation to the diet takes time and that you can actually lose performance while you're adapting, so might not recommend this to somebody who has a meet in a week. And I think what the studies clearly showed is that the diet does lead to body composition changes with preservation of performance in most athletes in sports. And this gives us the idea that the diet may have a role in sports or events where the body mass or body composition of the athlete is important. Future directions and things to be interested in. I think looking at events where differences are maybe even more likely to be found, so those being more like the ultra-endurance type of events where athletes are exercising for periods of hours or even days at a time, or events where there are repeated efforts frequently over a long time period. And then I think the idea of personalized interventions and of trying to get a better understanding of what athlete may respond best to what diet. Thanks.
Part of the joy of what we do with this fellowship is the fun and the humor that goes along with it. But it comes with a cautionary tale. When I have these guys over for dinner before they leave, I'm out grilling, preparing their dinner, and they're in my house looking for awkward pictures of me. Yeah. So we have to search them before they leave, and they show up at national meetings. The next speaker is Annie Nagengast. Annie has decided to do in life, she doesn't want to get a job, she wants to just keep doing one fellowship after another. And she has a very interesting talk on palliation and parenteral nutrition.
As Dr. McClave said, I'm going to be discussing the role of nutrition in incurable cancer. So my objective is to discuss specifically parenteral nutrition as a palliative treatment modality for patients with advanced cancer, and usually incurable. So we'll start with a case. We have a 42-year-old lady with stage 4 ovarian cancer. She underwent tumor debulking and chemotherapy, which was completed about 18 months ago. She presents to your clinic with a 3-week history of increasing PO intolerance, abdominal distension, and infrequent bowel movements as compared to her normal. Labs and imaging are performed in the office, and a CT scan is consistent with a malignant small bowel obstruction. So what is the role of nutrition in cancer treatment? Well, it really depends on the goal. Is the goal curative? As in, are we trying to support patients through treatment? Are we trying to counter the effects of malnutrition or sarcopenia or cachexia? And really just help them not die from something like malnutrition, because we know about 20% of patients die from the effects of that and not the malignancy itself. Or is our goal palliative, in that we're trying to help patients achieve the best quality of life and in a way that is in line with their goals of care? And that's really going to be the focus of my talk, is the palliative component of that goal. Briefly, though, I will mention that incurable cancer has kind of taken on the ability to be considered as a chronic disease process with the advancement of cancer treatment, with things like targeted therapy. It kind of brings closer the gap that exists between those separate goals being curative and palliative. So, initial recommendations on the use of parenteral nutrition in malignancy were published in 2001 in the American Gastroenterology Association review on parenteral nutrition specifically. And it very clearly stated that it absolutely does not alter survival in patients who are receiving cancer treatment, and it clearly is associated with net harm. Now, this was a systematic review based on studies from the 1970s and the 1980s. Since that time, there has been an increasing amount of literature from all over the world on the specific topic of parenteral nutrition for the management of malignant bowel obstruction, or the use of artificial nutrition in the palliative, in patients who are at home on palliative care. And so, overarchingly, there's sort of some general recommendations that come from reviewing all of that literature. And what they are kind of a similar set of goals of using parenteral nutrition as a form of treatment or therapy, therapy for cancer patients. And so what do we use that for? So preventing and treating cachexia in malnourished individuals, controlling the adverse effects of anti-tumor therapy, be it radiation, surgery, chemotherapy. And then from a palliative standpoint, it really truly is improving quality of life. And so back to our case. Our patient was admitted to the hospital. She was treated non-operatively with NG tube decompression, bowel rest, and IV fluids. A consult was placed to the general surgical service, who deemed her a non-operative candidate, and they recommended parenteral nutrition. So she has actually otherwise had a pretty decent performance status. She was initiated on parenteral nutrition in the hospital, and she had a goal of going home. She had planned a surprise birthday party for her 75-year-old dad, and she wanted to be there in 4 months. And so a consult was placed to the home parenteral nutrition services. They were able to evaluate all of the needs that she would require at home and had appropriate insurance coverage, and she was set up in about 4 to 5 days for home parenteral nutrition, and ultimately she was discharged there with a PICC line in place on parenteral nutrition. So what is the baseline criteria necessary to offer home parenteral nutrition to patients who are dying from cancer? Well, your expected survival needs to be at least 2 to 3 months. And enteral intake must be contraindicated because there's no reason to give you your fruits and veggies through your veins if you can use your gut. And so why would it be contraindicated? Because of things like my patient, malignant small bowel obstruction, or if enteral access is contraindicated in the patient and maybe they have refractory nausea, vomiting. There are a few different reasons to offer this. And then, of course, parenteral nutrition needs to be expected to at least maintain quality of life and performance status, if not improve it, but it shouldn't worsen either of those things. So what kind of current guidelines exist when it comes to home parenteral nutrition in the dying patient? ASPEN, there are none. There have been some recommendations made in conjunction with the Society of Critical Care Medicine. ASPEN published guidelines in 2017 on nutrition in cancer patients, and specifically, you can see here, a strong recommendation made for nutritional support in patients with advanced cancer. And I'll highlight here that in their recommendation, they say you must consider together with the patient the prognosis, and you must also explicitly discuss the burdens and the benefits of providing this type of therapy. And remember, the risks and the benefits are the same for cancer patients as they are for non-cancer patients when it comes to line infections, line dysfunction, electrolyte abnormalities. Just remember that when you're dealing with somebody who may have about 6 months of life, they may not tolerate line dysfunction as somebody who is a little more spry. And so that may hasten death. And it may also require them readmission to the hospital, which may very well not be in line with their goals of care. But the benefits are you can potentially mitigate dehydration. You can maybe increase their energy. You can combat some of the electrolyte abnormalities that having a malignant bowel obstruction may cause. And then you may very well improve their quality of life. But remember, you may very well not. And so it's important to establish very real expectations from the onset, because the last thing you want to do is promise somebody something and then not be able to follow through. So is the topic controversial? Yeah, I think it probably is, right? Because we can't predict survival, and that's really, really hard. And so making, you want the people to be able to live for 2 to 3 months, but there's no promise. And so that's difficult for us for me as a physician, as a surgeon, for sure, because these hands were also trained to operate. And when I can't do that and have to talk about dying, that's hard. And then, of course, anytime you talk about feeding or not feeding people, there are religious and personal beliefs that certainly deserve a seat at the discussion table. But really, I think what's important is to acknowledge and respect that people have beliefs and feelings about it. You can address them, but remember, everybody brings something else to the table. And then, of course, I discuss some of the risks and the benefits. But how can we be successful in this type of treatment modality or therapy at the end of life? So in conclusion, I think, like I said, setting realistic expectations and goals has to happen at the onset, because talking about dying is hard, especially when you're starting that conversation, say with my patient in the hospital, and you're trying to define both tangible and intangible goals. So what does that mean? If you're talking goals of care, in talking about that with someone who's awake, alert, and oriented and looks good, it's really hard to talk about the fact that they might be dying within a handful of months. And so what are the tangible goals you can talk about? You can talk about, I want to be at the 75th birthday party. And so once you reach that goal, then what? And then what are the intangible goals? The intangible goals are you want people to die with peace and you want them to die with dignity. And you can promise your best to make that happen. And that's really all that you can do. Same with the goals. You want them to get to that birthday party, the graduation, the wedding, all of those things, but all you can promise is that you'll do your best to help them achieve those goals. The other thing that is important, if we want to bring it back to some science, is designing studies to evaluate the effects of parenteral nutrition on quality of life, using quality of life as a primary outcome, specifically in this patient population. There are some studies that are underway that are looking at these very things. It's important to kind of watch those as they publish more data, and then also consider further studies. And finally, developing universal guidelines. And that may seem like a lofty goal as in what is next, but I think it's really important because I was talking with Dr. Bonas, my colleague, and they do have a home parenteral nutrition program that she helps run at the Mayo Clinic. And so there's not home parenteral nutrition at my institution, or say there's not. And so patients are mobile, and so you can go from one to the other. As an example, home parenteral nutrition, if I don't have it at my institution, say in Palmer, Alaska, and the patient's mobile and wants to travel somewhere, better? Okay. Wants to travel somewhere, you want to be speaking a common language. You want to have the same language, the same expectations, so that we can individualize and customize particular or specific patient care, but within a framework whereby we all understand what it is the patients are seeking and what you are offering the patients. And with that, I thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jason Rocha. He's a gastroenterology fellow at the University of Texas in San Antonio. He's going to be talking about the source of protein doesn't matter, and specifically talking about meat substitutes. Now, I have to say this is a very courageous talk to give, coming from Texas. But we look forward to it, and we're going to see if he can build a better burger.
That's right. Have you noticed a rise in meatless meat? How about meat? Our objectives today are to understand current sources of dietary protein, discover some drivers changing dietary protein sources, and appreciate the potential impact of incorporating alternative dietary proteins. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the meat that's most commonly consumed is pork, followed by poultry, beef, and mutton. However, only about 1/3 of our protein actually comes from animals that are raised for food. Most of our protein sources are vegetarian. Although there's over 14,000 edible plants, just 3 plant crops make up 60% of the food energy intake, namely wheat, rice, and maize. In 1990, the world's diet was composed mostly of cereals, about 20% due to oils, fats, and sugars, and 13.5% from meat, fish, milk, and eggs. In 2013, the diet in the United States has dramatically changed. We now have less than half the percent of cereals in our diet, twice the amount of fats and added sugars, and twice the amount of meat, milk, and eggs. So in middle-income and low-income countries, we've seen a dramatic rise in ultra-processed foods. The rise is actually higher than those in high-income countries. Furthermore, as countries become richer, the shares of calories that come from animal protein increase. Over the last 4 decades, meat production has actually tripled worldwide. And just last year, we had a record amount of 222 pounds of meat in retail shelves accessible to Americans. And by the way, the average American eats about 95 pounds per year. And just looking at the top 10 causes of deaths in high-income countries, we can see the toll that eating unhealthily has taken on our morbidity and mortality rates. What are the unhealthy foods, however? How about those foods associated with early death? Schwing, Shackle, and Lampusi screened 17,579 records to perform a systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective studies to discover the relative risk of all-cause mortality on servings of food groups per day. Their research team identified a significantly positive association between early death and consumption of red meat, processed meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, and eggs. On the contrary, they found an inverse association with consumption of whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, and fish. Last month, the Eat Lancet Commission out of Norway published their report on their development of global scientific targets, including a healthy diet based on sustainable food production. It was written in accordance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. The Commission described a universal healthy reference diet to provide an ideal benchmark for comparison to standard current diets that are full of unhealthy foods. The Commission noted that the global average intake of healthy foods is underconsumed in relation to the reference diet, whereas unhealthy foods are overconsumed. The top of the chart demonstrates that North America leads the pack in terms of consumption of red meat. So is this big, fat, juicy, mouth-watering burger to blame for our demise? Probably not. This one is made out of mushrooms and lentils. Besides, plant-based meat accounts for less than 1% of all retail meat dollar sales. Although, you can buy plant-based meat at over 95% of U.S. grocery stores now. In addition, the dollar sales change is increasing, with a sales change increase of 23% last year for plant-based meat, which is more than double the year before. With all this abundance of food, we must be mindful of the large impact food production has on global environmental change. Contributing 30% to greenhouse gas emissions, although agriculture occupies about 40% of global land, food production uses 70% of fresh water. And with the population nearing nearly 10 billion in 2050, the need to produce more food per unit of water becomes more important. Producing beef is inefficient. This bar graph compares the water productivity of beef, pork, chicken, almonds, soybeans, and crickets. Because larger animals have greater percentage of body mass that is either inedible or wasted, like bone, skin, blood, and cartilage, larger animals require higher feed conversion ratios. That is the amount of feed in kilograms to produce 1 kilogram of food. And of course, they also need more land to roam. So besides holding their weight in water, crickets and mealworms have other healthy benefits. They provide unsaturated fatty acids, iron, and zinc. Their chitin degradation products act as prebiotics and enhance immunity. And they also provide complementary amino acids, particularly for the developing people who are mostly consuming cereals, legumes, and tubers for complete nutrition. At the burger end of the spectrum, the total amount of water to bring this 1/3 pound deluxe bacon cheeseburger from farm to table is 831 gallons. That's enough to fill 2 hot tubs. Imagine that while eating your next burger. So this might explain in part why the Eat Commission's healthy reference diet, based on 2,500 calories per day, recommends just 7 grams of beef per day in order to achieve a win-win diet of health and sustainability. Following this recommendation makes the burger we just ate with our eyes 144 grams excessive. How do we feel about this diet? If we are not ready to nearly abandon eating meat, is it safe to enjoy white meat? This randomized controlled crossover study by Wang, Hazen, and others examined the effects of red meat, white meat, or non-meat protein isocaloric diets on atherogenic metabolites such as trimethylamine N oxide, commonly known as TMAO. They found that the typical American consumption of red meat, regardless of the saturated fat content, increases systemic levels of TMAO. They also noticed that discontinuation of dietary red meat reduced plasma TMAO levels within 4 weeks. Using isotope tracer studies, the increased plasma levels of TMAO were found to be mediated by enhanced dietary precursors, increased microbial TMA production from L-carnitine, and reduced TMAO excretion. This study's results, if extrapolated to recent findings, corresponded to 4.5% and 4.3% increase in relative risk of all-cause mortality compared to non-meat and white meat levels, respectively. In an attempt to supply rising beef demand while cutting down on environmental impact, food biologists are growing meat in the lab. This entails biopsy of cow skeletal muscle, mechanical or chemical breakdown of the tissue to individual cells, and then growing the muscle cells into fibers so that they can eventually wind together to form meat. On March 7th, the USDA and FDA announced a jointly established framework for regulating cell-based meat, thus accepting the probability that lab-grown meat will become a mainstream protein source. Promises of lab-grown meat to be healthier and tastier, however, will be unseen until 2021 when they hit grocery stores and some select restaurants later this year. Despite the associated cost of these lab-grown meat coming down 99%, early adopters will have to pay a premium. Relative to today's beef impact, lab-grown meat companies speculate that greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced by 96%, land use will be reduced by 99%, and fresh water use will be reduced by 96%. While stem cell food biologists work to improve yields by using gene editing techniques like CRISPR, chefs are using creative ways to make lab-grown meat more appealing. Although a tissue scaffold support structure, in order for these cultured meat cells to hold on to and take on the appearance and texture of what we think of a steak today, is lacking, tomorrow we will see creative uses, for example, knitting and pressing the meat together. It'll have a different taste and texture, but it's the future to come. So in summary, we learned that beef is here to stay and will probably make up a greater proportion of the global diet as more countries continue to become richer. At the same time, the number of meat alternatives are growing, in part to curb environmental changes. We need to stay current with changing dietary protein sources in order to give evidence-based recommendations that come from the collaboration between government, industry, and scientists. And discussing the concept of win-win, healthy and sustainable diets whenever possible might promote mindful eating. Thank you.
All right, so this is our last speaker, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're actually doing pretty good
Happy
on
birthday.
time. Yeah, so our last speaker, Dr. Tad Dryden, a full professor of gastroenterology. He's a partner of Steve McClave's at the University of Louisville. I guess a partner of mine. He's going to take us on a little ride through the influence of vitamin A on the gut immune response. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Go, get out now.
Thank you for that very interesting introduction there. So, yes. As Keith said, my name's Tad Dryden. I'm from the University of Louisville, and I am going to give you a 30,000 degree or a 30,000 foot overview of the role that vitamin A plays in establishing and maintaining intestinal immunity. Okay, so these are my disclosures, and I'll also put in the caveat that no humor nor any friendships were injured during this, the presentation or the building this presentation. So the objectives are to review the fate of ingested vitamin A and also understand how the intestinal epithelial cell utilizes vitamin A to direct the development and maintenance of mucosal adaptive immunity. So what is vitamin A? Vitamin A is a very important nutrient for maintaining balance in the intestinal immune system. You need it to establish your immune system, and you also need it to maintain homeostasis. Its status can be influenced by both dietary intake as well as environmental factors, and it can either help you or harm you, as known very well to the erudite audience out here. So it's also been used as a therapy to treat various disorders, sometimes with unintended consequences, such as the initiation of an inflammatory bowel disease and a patient being treated for acne. But if you think of vitamin A, think of it as a fuel for the furnace. You have to have some fuel in the system to be able to keep the heat on, but if you turn up the thermostat, your gut flora might actually not be able to take the immunological heat, as I'll show you a little bit later. So if you look around you, there's all kinds of research going on about the microbiome, but you have to admit that some of the clinical applications from microbiome research is a little bit forthcoming. Intestinal homeostasis is a little bit of an easier concept. You can almost think about intestinal homeostasis in your gut as an Airbnb. So you're constantly inviting people in to stay, they leave, and they're replaced by others. So the commensals are the good renters who come in and pay their bill, and the pathogens are the bad ones who trash the place and don't know when to leave. So when the bad ones show up, you actually want a way to be able to kick them out as soon as you can. The immune system is the sheriff's office that answers the phone when you call for help on 911. So homeostasis exists when the renters that are coming in actually cooperate with you and you don't have to call the sheriff. But we've learned a lot about intestinal homeostasis and the way that we interact with our gut immune system with our environment through the use of germ-free animals. So a new concept here probably for this dinner or this breakfast, but germ-free animals are a good way to study the development of the immune system. So they're kind of like newborn babies. Both examples, newborn babies, germ-free animals, have GI systems that are not colonized by bacteria, but these systems need to be ready to deal with the new environment that they're about ready to be plopped into. So both of these examples also have immature and preformed innate immune systems that are already in place, but those systems can only effectively handle a limited amount of trouble once they come out into the environment. They need to establish an adaptive immune system very quickly to be able to keep the intestinal infections in check. So real life experience is that which allows us to build up our adaptive immune component. So how that happens is through exposure to bacteria. And the dendritic cells are really the key to activating the adaptive immune system in the GI tract and beyond. They're also important in interpreting which bacteria are good and which are bad, because some strains will cause inflammation, as demonstrated over here with Clostridial features and B. fragilis, but others, such as Pseudomonas, can cause inflammation in the system. So when the calm system prevails over the inflammatory system, that's when you have achieved homeostasis. So there are also various other factors that your body puts up to be able to keep or maintain the homeostasis. So you have a lot of factors operating at any one point in time in your GI tract to try to control the microbial content of your gut so that you can actually live in peace and harmony with your intestinal bacteria. For instance, the GI tract is more acidic at the top, where, kind of like pickling, you preferentially promote the growth of lactobacillus over all other strains. There's also vigorous motility in the upper GI tract that kind of sweeps the bacteria down to the lower portion, and fortunately you have less vigorous activity in the most distal part of the colon, or we wouldn't be able to sit here through these presentations. There's also an increased production of antimicrobial peptides, or AMPs, that are secreted more vigorously in the upper GI tract to be able to help mold and shape the mixture of the bacteria that are present in the gut lumen and control the amount of bacteria that are there. And then if you get down to the distal part of the GI tract, you have secretion, more heavy secretion of mucins, which are actually forming a protective barrier and separating the bacteria in your lumen from the intestinal immune system that's lining the gut. All these are set up so that you can balance the need to intake nutrients with being able to maintain the balance of the immune system with the bacteria in the gut. So here's the first Western blot or Northern blot, or whatever kind of blot. These are actually demonstrations of the vitamin A content and some cell proliferation studies. So when you're born, you actually start eating vitamin A either through your mother's milk or formula, and your intestine simultaneously becomes with bacteria. So this leads to you needing to establish an immune system so that you can kind of keep things under control and not develop things like inflammatory bowel disease or be susceptible to infections. So interestingly enough, the maximal potential for activating an intestinal immune response corresponds with the site of maximal nutrient absorption, since this is where the gut is really leakiest. Because most of the absorptive activities actually occur in the proximal gut, this is where you have the highest levels of vitamin A content in the duodenum and jejunum, and this is also where you have the highest level of gut-homing cells, or the potential to develop gut-homing cells that will kind of fuel the adaptive immune response. And interestingly enough, this area is where you also develop the highest level of the T regulatory cells, which actually will help suppress inflammatory tendencies in the gut. So, what does this mean? Well, vitamin A comes along in the diet, and it serves as the fuel that feeds your adaptive immune system in the gut. And vitamin A really exists in 3 states after it is absorbed from the diet. The first is retinoic acid, which is the active form that the immune system utilizes to kind of drive its activities. Retinol, which is also used by the body to transport it around through the system and into the liver, and retinyl esters, which is the form that is used by the body to store vitamin A for future use. So there's an enzyme called RDH7, which is actually key for being able to direct the state in which vitamin A exists. It is not present during early fetal development, but it becomes active right before birth, and in germ-free animals, it's also highly expressed. So it needs to be available so that when you come into contact with vitamin A and you need to establish an immune system, that it is ready to go to work. So the germ-free state also is identical to the late fetal development, showing the highest level of RDH7. Interestingly enough, the germ-free state is actually characterized by high levels of retinoic acid that is being metabolized as it comes down through the diet by these green fluorescent cells in the intestinal epithelium. So the intestinal epithelium is the only place where this RDH7 is expressed in the body. So, life, and therefore intestinal colonization, is really not a static process. Your body needs to adapt to changing conditions, such as infection or change in the renters in your gut Airbnb. This is demonstrated best by the upregulation of RDH7 and subsequent production of retinoic acid after treating colonized animals with antibiotics. So here you see the RDH7 goes up, similar to what you see in germ-free intestinal epithelial cells, and the amount of retinoic acid that's being produced by those cells is also quite a bit higher. And what does that mean for the kind of change in our lifestyle? It turns out that if you kick out the good renters from your Airbnb, such as what happens when these lab animals who had a normal flora were treated with vancomycin to kill off the commensal organisms, some bad renters called Proteobacter take over. Now, the Proteobacter is one of those inflammatory non-commensals that needs to get kicked out of the system, or you're going to go on and have chronic inflammatory responses. So you call in the law with the good old RDH7. After treatment with antibiotics, that RDH7 level rises exponentially. And once dysbiosis kicks in, vitamin A metabolism reverts to a high level as seen in the the germ-free state, heats up the immune response by turning up retinoic acid thermostat. And you can see here by the increased presence of retinoic acid in small intestinal cells in animals that have been treated with vancomycin compared to animals that have not been treated with vancomycin. And so it turns out that after you turn up the vitamin A thermostat, known as RDH7, it kicks up the immunological heat via a cytokine called IL-22. Now, IL-22 is very important for being able to maintain, gut barrier function and things like that. But if you take away the RDH7 thermostat from the intestinal epithelial cell, they can't respond to changes in the microbial environment, as evidenced by low levels of IL-22 being secreted from important intestinal epithelial immune cells. So as you increase this IL-22, what it does is actually turn on the production of these antimicrobial peptides to high levels. And when that happens, that actually changes the microbial composition. So it turns out that too much of a good thing can actually be bad. Elevated AMP production can actually reduce the number of commensals that are present in the gut. And when that happens, it allows pathogens like salmonella to take hold in the gut, as well as other places in the body, such as the spleen. And this appears to be related to the level of IL-22 that is being produced, and also the corresponding antimicrobial peptide production. So if you look at the cells or the animals that don't have any RDH7, it actually prevents that overcorrection and prevents the escape of bacteria into the spleen. But IL-22 levels are also correspondingly low, and the level of antimicrobial peptides is quite low as well. So if you add in active retinoic acid back into the system, it actually recreates that dysbiosis, and you can see here that the fecal levels of salmonella go up quite significantly, as well as the invasive species into the spleen. And there's a corresponding rise in the number of antimicrobial peptides that are going on because of the increase in the IL-22 that occurs. So, in this few minutes that we've had to share in the basic science arena, I'd like to hope that I've been able to demonstrate to you that vitamin A is essential to initiate the development of the adaptive arm of the intestinal immune system. Without vitamin A, the vitamin A metabolic pathway, you don't really have the ability to adjust on the fly based on the mix of the intestinal bacteria that you have in your ever-changing intestinal microbial environment. RDH7 actually serves as the thermostat that turns up the immunological heat or turns it down based on the presence of bacteria in the first place or the type of bacteria that we happen to be harboring in our gut. Control of that immunothermostat can actually be overcome by oral administration of the active form of vitamin A in the form of retinoic acid. And this really has implications as we move forward how we test and use retinoic acid as a therapeutic immune modulator for both inflammatory bowel diseases as well as other nutritional conditions.
Yeah, hi, Evelyn Phillips from McGee Rehab. I have a question on high output ileostomies. Can you speak to the fact, now don't laugh, okay, but the use of marshmallows?
Marshmallows.
Okay, and how the heck does that work?
It doesn't work.
I don't know. But Sarah was telling me Sarah sees a lot of outpatients.
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
MCT oil, okay, to reduce or increase water reabsorption. And what type of tube feeding would you suggest in someone who's NPO?
Okay.
Elemental. Okay.
Three good questions.
So in terms of the tube feeding, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are some formulations that are not the hyperosmolar and that are isoosmolar. Not to get into any brand names, but there are some formulas available with that in mind, so avoiding the hyperosmolar and going more for that's not going to increase your output. MCT oil was something they studied back in the 90s, looking at are there benefits in patients, I believe, with a colon incontinuity. And now I'm blanking on which way it went, and it was basically there. Bob, which way did it go?
Yeah, no significant benefit to MCT, basically showed.
And then marshmallows, I think which you'll find in general with a lot of these patients is a lot of anecdotal stuff, which I think gets to the idea of everybody's a little bit different. And based on their current anatomy, Sarah mentioned to me that she has patients who mention that, the marshmallows. Again, I didn't find any data on that specifically. But again, working with your patient and identifying what works for them.
Yeah, the marshmallow data is all over the literature. Yeah. So people with short bowel go to Dr. Google, and Dr. Google says marshmallows will thicken up your stool. Yeah. Absolutely no data. In fact, that hyperosmolarity of they did a 3 ounce and a 6 ounce study, pulls more fluid in, and you actually get more diarrhea. So no physiology to fit it, although people will tell you it really works for me. So whatever.
Hi, I loved all of the participation from our speakers. I'm Ileana Munoz from Dominican Republic, and my question is on the low-carb ketogenic diet. It's really popular I think worldwide, and I wanted to know if there is any evidence on the effect, the metabolic effect on LDL cholesterol and triglycerides and uric acid, because I have a case at home of my son doing it, and his uric acid went up and his LDL went up. So what is your experience?
So that not being sort of the primary focus, I think that there's a lot of debate right now about how these diets can affect lipid profiles, and I think sort of more importantly, whether or not the lipid profile of a person who's on a ketogenic diet can really be interpreted using the same numbers and cutoffs in terms of trying to predict cardiovascular risk. And I think that's an area that, as we sort of have more patients who are on the diet, because as you say, it's much more popular now than it's been, is maybe something to be interested in, but I think that for the most part, when we see patients who have these changes in their lipid profiles as a result of the diet, I'm not sure that there's these, N of 50,000 studies that can really guide us as far as whether or not we're changing their cardiovascular risk profile or not. As far as the uric acid goes, my wife, who actually studies that phenomena in children and as it relates to kidney disease, would be very disappointed in me for really not having a lot to offer on the topic as far as that question goes. So, thankfully, she's not here, so I think I'm safe.
So congratulations, your topics were awesome. It was really great to sit through them. So I have two questions for Drs. Laster and Bonas. So you did pick a truly hot topic, emulsifiers and GI, all over the GI community right now. So how do you put your findings in context with the multitude of studies that we have that show that oral nutrition supplements and enteral nutrition are not only beneficial in maintaining remission in IBD, but in children, they are equivalent to steroids. So when everyone brings this to me, oh, emulsifiers are bad, I'm not gonna do this, I point to this more what I would call outcomes work as opposed to intermediates to show that we don't know everything about emulsifiers yet.
I think that's a great question, and that's one that I actually struggled with as I was looking through the literature as well, is we know that in certain food products, emulsifiers may be helpful as you look at the overall component. And so using the exclusive enteral nutrition for remission of IBD, particularly in peds, we know that those products are going to have emulsifiers in there. I think what we don't know is how does that impact the microbiome in that population? And how does it impact those other things in that population? So in some of these animal studies, they increase ruminococcus, which is associated with IBD, but presumably in that population, it may actually help promote that checks and balances of the overall bacteria there. I think that we can't avoid them altogether. I think we need to be conscious of what they're doing and look at more data as it comes out, but I don't think we have a clear answer. At least I didn't find one.
I also agree, and I also think all, like Sarah said, had in her talk, that all emulsifiers aren't created equally, so not all of them can be lumped into the horrible category. So I think those are some other things that are kind of in the future that we need to look at more, which emulsifiers are worse players and which ones actually have the most impact on the microbiota and actually change their composition for the bad. So
remember, the first studies that showed diet and inflammatory bowel, especially in adolescents, were with elemental diet, which are powdered. They didn't have emulsifiers. Okay, and those are the studies where people say diet lowers inflammatory bowel disease. Those are non-emulsifiers because they were powder, and they made up from powder. So I think that was the key. They didn't need emulsifiers. So I think many times we look back now, but I think in generally we have to be very careful, especially with this population who's got a very fragile, level. We don't really know the cause of this, but I think it's a great question and it has to be investigated.
Good morning. Thank you for all your wonderful information. I had a question on vitamin A. Wanted to understand how much is too much and for how long, and also ask if you can talk very briefly about any interaction with vitamin D in the gut with vitamin A.
So as far as the amount, I certainly would stay with the recommended daily allowances. We tend not to hyper-administer vitamin A just because of the risk of toxicity and the increased risk of storage. So most of the studies that have actually looked at using a form of vitamin A for treatment of inflammatory diseases or other things such as acne, and that's where we're getting into using some of the breakdown products that are already preformed and can get away from some of the toxicities that are associated with vitamin A itself.
I was thinking about provision of vitamin A for wound care.
Okay. Yeah, actually, Bob was talking about that earlier. There is a little bit of experience. Oh, and no, I'm sorry. It was one of our dinners. So, yeah, there's a regimen that I think that you can use 10,000 units a day for a couple of months or a couple of weeks. And that does not seem to promote toxicity, but yet it seems to be getting around some of the regulatory pathways and being able to shunt into the healing process so that you avoid some of the complications of steroids, but yet get the beneficial tissue effects. I have to admit that that's not really, that clinical area is not really something that I'm terribly familiar with, but I have heard some discussion about that. And you can get away without toxicity while still modulating the immune system. And speaking of vitamin A, and I mean, this concept of emulsifiers and inflammation in the gut, I mean, there are so many checks and balances of inflammation. There's so many redundancies. That's probably one of the reasons why we don't see widespread inflammation associated with these changes in the dysbiosis. This is why I'm saying that the microbiome research is really interesting, and I think it's going to be very informative, but it has the ability, or it doesn't really have the ability to inform our current clinical practices.
Yeah, the vitamin A and wound healing data is very good. Started with the University of California, San Francisco with Dr. Hunt about 40 years ago. The best data is actually on the corneal abrasion studies in rabbits. If you have vitamin A on board, 25,000 unit equivalent to a human, you get rapid healing. That took off. So people then started using massive amounts of vitamin A. It's usually 10 to 25,000 units for a week to 10 days, increases rates of epithelialization. After that, there's no data after the first couple of weeks. Once you load it, then it doesn't seem to help, like you mentioned. Go ahead.
In conclusion, I want to make two kind of additions to what Bob spoke about earlier. If somebody comes up to this meeting and says, you know, we see the same old faces every meeting, why aren't there anybody new physicians in nutrition? I think you need to say, hold it, pal. This is the face of nutrition of the future. And when we see the quality of these talks and the excitement and the humor and the intelligence that they bring to nutrition, I'm fine that the future of nutrition is intact. The second thing is that we have been doing this 10 years now, this fellowship. And if it weren't for the nature and of Nestle and their altruism, we could not have been as successful. So their continued support and fueling the fire of this enthusiasm, it wouldn't have been possible without Nestle. So thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you.